Demonstration Nugget, AWS NoSQL DynamoDB. Hey everyone, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget, we're going to take a quick look at the management console for Amazon's DynamoDB, their NoSQL database in the cloud solution. We'll launch the console and see how easy it is to create a new table, a new top-level organizational item for DynamoDB from the interface. Then, having built that table, we'll insert some new items into it, both creating a new schema for each new item, as well as duplicating an existing schema. And then we'll finish by talking a little bit about capacity management and how we can reserve and provision capacity for our activity inside of DynamoDB. From AWS.Amazon.com, we'll select to sign into the console, and I'm going to log in with my IAM user that has administrative rights on DynamoDB so that I can properly access the console. Now, generally speaking, you're going to access DynamoDB through code. Your applications are going to interact directly with the database. You're not going to do much inside of the developer's console here, but it is nice to see how it works. And if you scroll down to the database section and find DynamoDB, you can get a really good feel for how DynamoDB is structured and organized simply by working with it here inside of the management console. The first time you fire it up, if you don't have any tables, you get this nice little Getting Started panel here, Amazon DynamoDB, and you can select to create a table. Now recall that DynamoDB does not have any sort of database structure, top-level database structure. The top level of DynamoDB is a table, so every table is kind of its own thing. And here we give it a table name. If you hover over the I, it tells you the rules about what the table name can be. Let's call this one employee. It'll be a table to store employees. And the second thing I have to choose here is the primary key, also known as the partition key. Recall that every table has to have at least one primary key attribute that every item inside of this table will have to have. So there's no rule that says that the items have to share attributes. Every item in our table can have completely different attributes, but for the keys. If there's a partition key and a sort key, every item has to have those values, and I can choose what type of attribute it can be, string, binary, or number. I'll leave it at string, and I'll call it emp ID. That will reflect the employee ID. If I wanted to, I could add a sort key in here as well to give it a secondary ID, or a secondary key. And then on the second section of this panel, you can see the table settings has default settings with no secondary indexes and provisioned capacity set to 5 reads and 5 writes. If I uncheck this, I could configure that however I wanted, but I'll leave the default settings on. Select Create, and it's going to jump over and create my table. This will just take a moment. Once that finishes, you'll see that the tabs over here on the right-hand side of the page have highlighted so that I can view the different pieces of this table. Items, of course, is going to list the items that are inside of this table. I don't have any right now, but I could simply click Create Item. And this is going to give me a little interface that I can use in order to create an item. So we'll make employee ID 001, and then we will add a new, let's append a string, and we'll call it first. And the first will be Ben. All right. Then we'll append another one. Let's do another string and call it last. And that will be Finkel. Hey, that's me. All right, I'm employee 001. I click Save. Now I've got one item listed in this table. It's employee ID 001 for Ben Finkel. If I create a new item here, see that the first and the last name went away. I've only got employee ID because that's my partition key, so I've got to fill that out. But from there, oops, I can choose to append additional fields or additional attributes that don't have to be the same. So now I can just do name instead of first or last, and I can say Julie Smith. July Smith? Julie Smith. Click Save, and you see how it represents the two different items here. The name only exists on this particular item, employee ID 002, while first and last only exist for employee ID 001. So again, to reiterate, the table does not force the schema onto the items. The table is just a top-level container for all of these items. It's up to us as the developers to enforce any kind of schema or rules that we want to apply to those items. When you're working here inside of the interface, if you want to ensure that you don't totally screw up your schema, a good feature to know about is duplicate. So I can highlight an item here by clicking this little square on the left and pull down this Actions drop-down. You see I could export it to a CSV if I wanted, I could delete it, I could edit it. But most importantly, I have the duplicate option. What that does is that loads up the item editor like we saw before, but it pre-populates it with the values from that item. So that's kind of nice. It makes sure that I have all of the same attributes with all the same properties. Now I can't just click Save right here, and why not? Well, because I didn't change my employee ID. My primary key needs to be different if it's going to save in this table. So I'm going to update that to a unique primary key. Click Save, and now I've got 003 with duplicated attributes from my very first item there. So you can use the duplicate feature in order to ensure that you do get a consistent schema Let's say if you're playing around with some sample data or some test data here inside of your console. Another important piece of information here to look at your table is the capacity tab. This tells me how many read capacity units and write capacity units I have provisioned for this table. Recall that you provision them at the table level. We left it at the defaults when we created this table, which was 5 and 5, and that tells me what the estimated cost is. Over here on the left-hand side, I can see my provisioned capacity versus my reserved capacity. So what this tells me is how much capacity I've provisioned, how much I'm going to be paying for, versus how much I have reserved. Reserved capacity is capacity that you purchase ahead of time. You see down on the bottom it tells you you can purchase it for a full year or 3-year terms. You get a discounted price for a high volume of capacity, and then when you provision capacity it comes against that reserve capacity as opposed to charging you on top of that. So if you do have a high volume, a good plan for a high volume of usage of DynamoDB, reserve capacity is a good way to potentially save yourself some money. Ultimately, that's about it to DynamoDB. It's very, very simple, and the devil is in the implementation details. When you're using DynamoDB inside of your code, you got to make sure that you set up your indexes properly in Dynamo, but then build your queries and build your code appropriately to work with a NoSQL database. So that concludes this demonstration nugget for Amazon's DynamoDB, their NoSQL database in the cloud. Just to recap, we looked at how easy it was to create a new table with the wizard inside of Amazon's management console. There's not a whole lot to a table. We simply give it a name, choose a primary key, and then choose a couple of different options for capacity management and local secondary indexes. Then we inserted some items into that table, also using the interface, although acknowledging that that's not typically the way we're going to do it in a production capacity. And finally, we looked at exactly how we manage and provision read and write capacity units for our tables. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.